The blizzard swallowed the world in white, but through the screaming wind, an Apache warrior heard a faint cry, a child's cry. When he found the small Comanche boy half buried in the snow, he realized fate had delivered him the son of the man who burned his village. The warrior's name was Natch, which meant mischief maker in the language of his mother, though there had been no mischief in him for 3 winters now. Not since the smoke rose black against the autumn sky, and the screams of his people became a permanent echo in the caverns of his skull. He stood now in snow to his knees, his breath coming in sharp clouds that the wind tore apart before they could fully form, and he stared down at the small shape that should not have existed in this desolate stretch of the Llano Estacado, this staked plain where even the buffalo knew better than to wander when the sky turned the color of old iron, and the air itself became a blade. The child was perhaps 5 winters old, maybe 6, dressed in buckskin leggings and a small buffalo robe that had twisted around his body as he crawled through the drifts. His lips were blue, his fingers curled into tiny fists that no longer moved, and Natch recognized the beadwork on the child's moccasins, the pattern of the Numunu, the Comanche, the lords of the plains, the people who had followed the war chief Takia into the valley where Natch's village had stood 3 autumns past. The people who had set the lodges burning while the women gathered mesquite beans by the river. The people who had taken everything. Natch's hand moved to the knife at his belt, his fingers closing around the carved bone handle that had belonged to his father, who had died in those flames trying to reach Natch's mother, who had already fallen with an arrow through her throat. The wind howled louder, a sound like all the spirits of the dead crying out at once, and the child's eyelids fluttered, his mouth opening to release a small whimper that was barely audible above the storm's fury. Natch looked up at the white sky, at the snow that fell so thick he could barely see his own hands, and he thought about how easy it would be to turn away, to let the white death take this child as it had taken so many others, to let the cold finish what exposure had started. But his hand released the knife and instead reached down, scooping the boy up from the drift, pulling him against his chest where the warmth of his body might offer some protection against the killing cold that surrounded them both. The child was light, too light, his body already beginning the slow surrender to the storm, and Natch wrapped his own blanket around them both, creating a small cocoon of shared heat as he turned his back to the wind and began to walk. He had been tracking a wounded elk for 2 days, following blood spots in the snow that led deeper into the high country, away from the winter camp where his band of Apache had settled in a sheltered canyon near the Pecos. The elk had been his last chance for meat before the big snows came, before the passes closed and travel became impossible. But the animal had proven more resilient than expected, leading him far from safety, and now the storm had descended like a white curtain, erasing all tracks, all landmarks, all hope of quick return. He should have turned back yesterday when the clouds gathered on the northern horizon like a bruise spreading across pale skin. He should have known better than to chase game when the signs spoke so clearly of coming disaster. But hunger made men foolish, and grief made them foolisher still, and Natch had spent 3 years being both hungry and grieving, moving from camp to camp with the remnants of his band, watching children grow thin and old people grow quiet, watching the light fade from eyes that had once reflected the fierce joy of a people who knew themselves to be favored by the spirits. The Apache had never been numerous like the Comanche, had never commanded the vast hunting grounds or the immense horse herds, but they had been free, had owned their mountains and their canyons and their pride, and now they owned only the clothes on their backs and the memories that weighed heavier than stone. The child stirred against his chest, a small movement that suggested life still clung to the tiny body, and Natch adjusted his grip, tucking the boy more securely into the blanket as he pushed through snow that reached his thighs in some drifts. His moccasins were already soaked through, his feet beginning to lose sensation, and he knew with the certainty of a man who had survived many winters that he had perhaps an hour, maybe 2, before the cold claimed him as well. The storm showed no signs of breaking, the wind driving snow horizontal across the plain, turning the world into a uniform white that had no dimension, no distance, no direction. He needed shelter, needed fire, needed wood and water, and a dozen other things that did not exist in this frozen wasteland. And he carried the son of his enemy against his heart, while the wind tried to tear them both apart. The irony was not lost on him, though he took no pleasure in it, no sense of cosmic justice or divine humor. There was only the cold and the wind and the small weight in his arms that represented everything he had lost and everything he hated, wrapped together in the form of a child who had no more choice about his father than Natch had about his own. He walked. The land here was deceptive in its flatness, appearing from a distance to be as level as a stretched hide. But in truth, it was cut with arroyos and draws, small depressions where water ran during the brief rains, and where snow now gathered in deep banks that could swallow a horse. Natch moved carefully, testing each step, aware that a broken leg in this storm would be a death sentence not just for him, but for the child as well. His eyes scanned constantly for any break in the monotonous white, any darker shadow that might indicate an outcropping of rock or a cluster of juniper where they might find some relief from the wind's relentless assault. The boy coughed against his chest, a wet sound that spoke of water in the lungs, of the body's systems beginning to fail, and Natch felt the small chest shudder with each breath. He increased his pace despite the exhaustion that sat like a stone in his own chest, despite the way his legs trembled with each step, despite the knowledge that he was burning through his remaining strength at a rate that would leave him helpless well before nightfall. The sun was invisible behind the clouds, but he sensed its position by some instinct buried deep in the bones of men who lived close to the land, and he calculated that perhaps 3 hours remained before full darkness, 3 hours to find shelter or die trying. A depression opened before him, a shallow draw that ran roughly east to west, and he slid down into it, grateful for the momentary respite from the wind's full force. The snow here was deeper, but less disturbed, forming smooth drifts that rose and fell like frozen waves, and along the northern bank he spotted a darker shadow that might have been nothing or might have been everything. He struggled toward it, his breath coming in gasps now, the cold burning his lungs with each inhalation. And as he drew closer, he saw that it was indeed an overhang, a place where the bank had eroded and the layers of caliche had formed a small cave, barely large enough for a man to crouch in, but offering blessed protection from the wind. He crawled inside, dragging the child with him, and immediately the howling of the storm became muted, distant, as though they had passed through some invisible barrier into a quieter world. The space was perhaps 6 feet deep and 4 feet high, the floor covered in dry sand and the scattered droppings of animals that had sheltered here in seasons past. Natch laid the boy down on the sand, unwrapping the blanket enough to see the child's face, to assess the damage the cold had done. The boy's lips were still blue, his skin pale as ash, his breathing shallow and irregular. Ice had formed in his eyebrows and in the fine black hair that escaped from beneath his buffalo robe. And when Natch touched the small hands, he found them frozen into rigid claws, the flesh hard as wood. He had seen this before, had seen men survive it and seen men lose fingers and toes, had seen gangrene set in and turn living flesh black as charred meat, and he knew the boy's chances were poor without fire and hot food and sustained warmth. But fire required wood, and wood did not exist on the open plain, except in the scattered junipers that clung to rocky outcrops miles apart. And to search for fuel in this storm would be to abandon the child, to let him die alone in this hole while Natch struggled through drifts in pursuit of branches that might already be buried too deep to find. He pulled the boy close again, rubbing the small arms and legs with firm strokes, trying to force blood back into extremities that had nearly forgotten its presence, trying to generate warmth through friction when no other source existed. The child's eyes opened, dark pools that held no recognition, no understanding, only the vague confusion of a mind hovering between sleep and death. Natch found himself staring into those eyes, seeing in them something he had not expected, a reflection not of the war chief Takia, not of the burning village or the screaming women, but of his own sister's boy, little Delche, who had been 4 winters old when the Comanche came, who had hidden in a storage pit and suffocated on smoke while the raiders methodically destroyed everything above ground. This child had the same shape to his face, the same slight hook to his nose, the same way of parting his lips when he breathed, and the resemblance struck Natch like a physical blow, stealing his breath more effectively than the cold ever could. He turned away, focusing instead on the practical matters of survival, on the assessment of their situation and the calculation of options. The storm would last perhaps 2 days, maybe 3, based on the color of the sky before the snow began and the way the wind had built from the north in steady increments rather than sudden gusts. Without fire, they could not survive that long, not with the child already half frozen and Natch's own reserves depleted from 2 days of hard travel and inadequate food. He had perhaps half a pound of dried venison in the parfleche at his belt, enough for 1 meal, maybe 2 if stretched, but not enough to sustain 2 lives through a prolonged siege. The wind shifted slightly, driving snow into the mouth of their small cave, and Natch moved to block the opening with his body, using the blanket to create a barrier between them and the storm. The temperature inside rose fractionally, enough that he could feel his fingers again, enough that the shivering that racked his body became slightly less violent. The boy shivered too, a good sign, a sign that the body still fought for survival, and Natch held him close, sharing what warmth remained in his own flesh, buying time while his mind worked through possibilities. He could remain here and hope the storm broke quickly, hope that they could survive on shared body heat and the meager food supply until the skies cleared and travel became possible again. He could leave the boy here and search for wood, gambling his own life against the chance of finding fuel in time to save them both. He could take the boy and continue moving, knowing that motion generated heat, but also knowing that each step through the deep snow drained strength they could not afford to lose. All choices led toward death in varying degrees of certainty. All paths ended in the same white silence, and yet the Apache way taught that life was itself a choosing, that even in the face of certain defeat, a man could select the manner of his going, could assert his will against the void and thereby achieve a kind of victory. Natch chose to wait, chose to gamble on the storm's brevity and the resilience of flesh, chose to sit in that small cave with his enemy's son pressed against his chest while the wind screamed its frustration outside. He pulled strips of dried venison from his parfleche, working them in his mouth until they softened enough to chew, and then he chewed them slowly, letting saliva mix with the meat until it became a paste he could swallow without choking. He did this with half the meat, saving the rest for the boy, and then he carefully opened the child's mouth and began to work small amounts of the paste onto the small tongue, hoping the body's reflexes would trigger swallowing even in this diminished state. The boy gagged, coughed, but some of the meat went down, and Natch continued the process with patient determination, feeding the child the way a mother bird feeds her nestlings, with tiny portions and long pauses between each offering. It took perhaps an hour to get half the remaining meat into the boy, and by the end the child's eyes had closed again. His breathing had steadied slightly, and a faint hint of color had returned to his lips. Natch wrapped them both more tightly in the blanket, positioning himself between the boy and the cave opening, using his body as a windbreak and his remaining heat as a shield against the cold. Outside, the wind continued its assault, piling snow against the bank, building drifts that would soon cover the cave mouth entirely. And Natch thought about suffocation, about the way snow could seal a shelter and turn it into a tomb, about the need to periodically clear the entrance or wake to find themselves buried alive. But exhaustion weighted his limbs with iron, pulled his eyelids down despite his resistance, and he found himself drifting toward sleep even as a distant part of his mind screamed warnings about the danger of unconsciousness in such cold. He jerked awake sometime later, his heart hammering with the instinctive panic of a hunted animal, and for a moment he could not remember where he was or why the weight on his chest felt wrong. Then he saw the boy, saw the small face relaxed in sleep, saw the rise and fall of the narrow chest, and memory returned in a rush that brought with it the familiar ache of loss and the newer confusion of responsibility. The cave mouth was indeed blocked with snow, the light that filtered through the packed white suggesting either late afternoon or early morning, impossible to determine without seeing the sky. Natch carefully disentangled himself from the child and crawled to the entrance, using his hands to dig through the barrier, creating an opening large enough for air but small enough to retain some warmth. The storm had lessened but not broken, the wind reduced to a steady push rather than the violent gusts of earlier, the snow falling straight down now in thick flakes that suggested hours more of accumulation. Natch estimated they had been in the cave for perhaps 6 or 7 hours, which meant night approached if his earlier calculations of the sun's position had been correct, which meant another long darkness to survive before daylight might offer some advantage. He pulled back into the cave, sealing most of the opening behind him, and returned to the boy's side. The child was awake, his eyes open and watching, his small body rigid with fear. Natch saw himself through those eyes, saw the dark skin and the lean face and the traditional Apache way of wearing his hair long and bound with a strip of red cloth, saw the scars that marked his arms and chest from battles and ceremonies, saw the knife at his belt and the hard expression that years of warfare and grief had carved into his features. He saw an enemy, a monster, the embodiment of every story the Comanche told their children about the mountain raiders who came in the night and took what they wanted and vanished like smoke. Natch made no sudden moves, simply sat and looked back at the boy, letting the child take his measure, letting fear exhaust itself in the absence of immediate threat. After a long moment, the boy's eyes moved past him to the cave opening, to the wall of white beyond, and understanding seemed to dawn in the small face, understanding that whatever terror this Apache warrior represented, it was preferable to the certain death that waited outside. The boy's body relaxed fractionally, though his eyes remained wary, tracked every movement Natch made. Natch pulled out the last of the dried venison, divided it into 2 portions, and held out the smaller piece toward the boy. The child stared at the offering, his small throat working as he swallowed, his hunger clearly warring with his fear, and for a long moment nothing happened. Then slowly, with the caution of a wild animal approaching a trap, the boy's hand emerged from beneath the buffalo robe and reached for the meat. His fingers closed around it, and he pulled back quickly, retreating to the far corner of the small space, as far from Natch as the cave allowed, and there he crouched and ate with desperate speed, his eyes never leaving the warrior's face. Natch ate his own portion more slowly, chewing thoughtfully, considering the problem the child represented. The boy was perhaps 3 days' travel from the nearest Comanche winter camp, assuming Natch's memory of the territory was accurate and the camps had not shifted since last autumn. The storm would have scattered any hunting parties, would have driven warriors back to the safety of their lodges, but once the weather cleared, scouts would certainly be searching for the lost child. They would find tracks eventually, would follow the signs, and when they discovered their war chief's son in the company of an Apache warrior, they would assume kidnapping, would assume the worst intentions, would kill first and investigate never. The logical course would be to leave the boy here, to slip away during the night and let the Comanche find their own. But leaving a child alone in a cave during a blizzard was death as surely as putting a knife through his ribs, and Natch found that despite everything, despite the village and his family and 3 years of nursing hatred like a wound that would not close, he could not walk away from that dark-eyed boy who looked so much like Delche, could not become the monster the Comanche already believed him to be, which meant he would have to carry the child back, would have to find the winter camp and approach close enough to leave the boy where he would be found, would have to do all this while avoiding Comanche patrols and managing his own survival in hostile territory during the worst weather of the season. The prospect was nearly laughable in its impossibility, the kind of task a man undertook when he had nothing left to lose and no longer cared about the outcome. Natch had lost everything 3 years ago. What remained was merely the walking and breathing continuation of a man who should have died with his family, who had survived only because he had been away from the village that day, hunting in the mountains while his world burned. He had carried that guilt the way other men carried medicine bundles, had worn it close to his skin where it rubbed against his heart with every breath, and perhaps this was why he now sat in a cave with his enemy's son, instead of following the sensible path of abandonment. Perhaps he saw in this small life a chance at something he could not name, something that was not quite redemption, but was at least adjacent to it. The boy finished his meat and licked his fingers, his eyes still locked on Natch with that mixture of fear and desperate hope that children showed when they were lost and found and did not yet know which was worse. Natch gestured to the space beside him, patting the sand, indicating warmth and safety, but the boy shook his head and pressed himself harder against the cave wall. Natch shrugged, wrapped himself in the blanket, and closed his eyes, feigning sleep while remaining alert to any movement, any sound that might indicate threat or escape attempt. The child sat rigid for perhaps an hour, his small body tense with vigilance, but eventually exhaustion won its inevitable victory, and the boy slumped against the wall, his eyes closing, his breathing evening into sleep's rhythm. Only then did Natch truly relax. Only then did he allow himself to drift into the light doze of a warrior who had learned to sleep with one part of his mind always listening, always assessing danger. He woke several times during the night to clear the cave entrance of snow, and each time the storm had diminished further, the wind dying to a whisper, the snowfall thinning until only scattered flakes drifted down from a clearing sky. By what he judged to be an hour before dawn, the storm had passed entirely, leaving behind a world transformed into a landscape of white curves and sharp shadows where the moon caught drifts and turned them silver. Natch emerged from the cave, his body stiff from cold and cramped quarters, and surveyed their situation with the dispassionate eye of a man calculating odds. The snow lay perhaps 3 feet deep on level ground, deeper in the drifts, and the temperature had dropped as the clouds cleared. The air now so cold it hurt to breathe, so cold that exposed skin would freeze in minutes. The moon was 3 days past full, bright enough to cast shadows, bright enough to travel by if a man was desperate or foolish enough to attempt movement through such deep snow. Natch was both. He returned to the cave, shook the boy awake, and began the process of preparing them both for travel. He tore strips from his blanket and wrapped them around the child's hands and feet, adding extra layers of insulation where the boy's own clothing was inadequate. He secured the child to his back, using the remainder of the blanket fashioned into a crude sling, distributing the weight across his shoulders and chest, leaving his hands free to grab branches or rocks for balance as he traveled. The boy made no sound during these preparations, accepting the handling with the passivity of someone who had surrendered all agency to forces beyond his control. They set out under the moon's cold eye, Natch breaking trail through virgin snow that came nearly to his waist, each step requiring him to lift his leg high and then pack down the snow with his weight before taking another step. Progress was measured in yards rather than miles, each 100 paces leaving him winded and trembling. But he continued with methodical determination, angling south and east toward where memory insisted the winter camp should be, trusting instincts honed over decades of reading landscape and weather, and the subtle signs that indicated water and shelter, and the places people chose to make their homes. The boy's weight on his back grew heavier with each step, or perhaps it was Natch's strength that diminished, the effect being the same either way. His legs burned, his lungs ached, his vision narrowed to the immediate space before him. The next step and the next, the endless repetition of lift and push and sink that defined travel through deep snow. The land rolled gently here, offering no landmarks, no features that might confirm his chosen direction. Only the endless white, interrupted occasionally by the skeletal forms of yucca or the dark punctuation of juniper clumps that rose from the snow like islands in a frozen sea. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to deep blue to pale pink, and with the light came the full revelation of their isolation, the absolute emptiness of the plain stretching in all directions without variation or relief. Natch paused on the crest of a low rise, scanning the horizon for any sign of smoke or movement, seeing nothing but snow and sky meeting in a perfect circle that placed them at the exact center of desolation. The boy stirred on his back, the small body shivering despite the wrappings, and Natch felt the tremors transfer through to his own flesh, felt the terrible fragility of the life he carried, and the enormous weight of the responsibility he had accepted. He continued east, driven now by a growing sense of urgency, by the knowledge that without food and fire they would not survive another night, by the understanding that his own reserves were nearly exhausted, and once he stopped moving, he might not be able to start again. The sun climbed above the horizon, bringing light but no warmth, the temperature remaining well below freezing, and with the sunlight came the increased danger of being spotted by any scouts or hunters who might be abroad. Natch moved more cautiously now, using whatever cover the terrain offered, avoiding the open tops of rises, staying in draws and depressions where possible. His track through the snow was like a dark scar across the white, impossible to hide, leading any pursuer straight to him. But there was no help for that, no way to travel without leaving signs, and speed seemed more important than stealth at this point. Near midday he found tracks, the signs of a party of riders who had passed this way perhaps 2 days before the storm, heading northeast at a steady pace. The tracks were half filled with snow, but still readable to a man who had learned tracking from masters, and Natch counted perhaps 8 horses, all carrying riders based on the depth of the impressions, moving purposefully rather than wandering. A hunting party, he judged, or perhaps scouts ranging far from the winter camp. And while their presence confirmed he was moving in the right direction, it also meant increased danger of discovery. He altered his course slightly, angling more to the south to avoid intersection with the tracks, and as he did so he heard the boy make a small sound, the first voluntary noise the child had made since Natch found him. Natch stopped, turned his head to look at the small face beside his shoulder, and saw that the boy's eyes were open, were focused on the tracks, were filling with tears that spilled down his cheeks and froze almost instantly in the cold air. The child knew those tracks, recognized them as his people's, understood that safety and home lay in the direction they led, and he was being carried away from them by an enemy warrior for purposes he could only imagine in his terror. Natch felt the small body tense, felt the drawing breath that preceded a cry for help, and he made a decision in the space between heartbeats. He lowered himself to his knees in the snow, brought the boy around to his front, and looked directly into those dark eyes that held such fear and confusion and desperate hope. Natch pointed to the tracks, then pointed in the direction they led. He touched his own chest, then touched the boy's chest, then made the hand sign for travel, for going towards something. He did this several times, slowly, letting the meaning penetrate, letting the child understand that they were not fleeing from the Comanche, but moving toward them, that the warrior's intention was not to harm but to return. The boy stared at him, trying to parse meaning from gesture, trying to reconcile the signs with his understanding of how enemies behaved, and slowly, with visible effort, he nodded. Natch returned the boy to his back and continued moving, and this time when the small body pressed against him, it was with something approaching trust, or at least with the temporary suspension of panic that allowed for the possibility of hope. They traveled through the afternoon, Natch's pace slowing incrementally as exhaustion accumulated, the sun tracking across the southern sky and beginning its descent toward evening, and still the land showed no variation, no signs of human presence beyond the half-buried tracks they had crossed hours before. As the sun touched the horizon, painting the snow with shades of gold and pink that would have been beautiful in any other circumstance, Natch spotted smoke. A thin gray line rising from behind a low ridge perhaps 2 miles distant, visible only because the air was so still and clear, so free of the storm's turbulence. Smoke meant fire, meant people, meant food and warmth and shelter, and it also meant discovery and questions, and the very real possibility of violence once his identity became known. Natch angled toward the smoke, moving more carefully now, using every scrap of cover, approaching the ridge with the caution of a man entering enemy territory, because that was precisely what he was doing. The boy had seen the smoke as well, his body tensing with excitement or renewed fear, and Natch felt small hands grip his shoulders, felt the child's breath quicken against his neck. He stopped well short of the ridgeline, lowering himself into a depression where wind had scoured the snow down to bare ground, and there he crouched and studied the situation. The smoke rose steadily, suggesting a well-established fire, not the temporary blaze of travelers, but the maintained hearth of a camp. He needed to know how many people, how they were positioned, whether they were Comanche or possibly another tribe entirely. And to learn these things, he needed to get closer, needed to see over the ridge without being seen himself. Natch removed the boy from his back, setting him down in the shelter of the depression, and through signs he indicated that the child should remain silent and still, should not move or call out no matter what happened. The boy nodded, his eyes huge in his small face, and Natch saw in that face the beginning of something he had not expected, something that looked almost like faith. He moved toward the ridge on his belly, crawling through snow that soaked his clothing and chilled his flesh, pulling himself forward by inches, keeping his profile below the line where earth met sky. The snow here was shallower, wind-scoured, and as he neared the crest he could smell wood smoke and cooking meat, could hear the faint murmur of voices carried on the still air. He eased his head up slowly, just enough to see over the ridge, and what he saw made his heart contract with a complex mixture of emotions he had no time to examine. Below him, in a small valley protected from wind by the surrounding rises, sat a Comanche camp. 3 lodges arranged in a loose triangle around a central fire, perhaps 20 people visible, moving between the structures or tending to tasks around the fire. Horses were picketed on the valley's eastern side, perhaps 30 animals standing hip-shot in the snow, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. Children played near the lodges, their shouts and laughter reaching him as small sounds of joy that seemed impossible in such a harsh landscape. And standing near the fire, directing activities with the authority of leadership, was a man Natch recognized even at this distance, even after 3 years of trying to forget the face that haunted his dreams. Takia, the war chief. Taller than the men around him, broader in the shoulders, moving with the coiled energy of a warrior in his prime. The man who had led the raid on Natch's village. The man whose son currently waited in a snow-filled depression 200 yards behind where Natch lay. Natch felt his hand move to his knife, felt the familiar weight of the weapon, felt the surge of emotion that was rage and grief tangled so completely that they had become one thing, one driving force that had sustained him through 3 years of wandering and loss. He had imagined this moment countless times, had planned and discarded 100 scenarios for vengeance, and now fate had delivered both the opportunity and the perfect leverage. He held Takia's son. He could trade the boy's life for his own satisfaction, could call the war chief out from the safety of his camp, could face him blade to blade and settle the debt in blood as Apache tradition demanded. But as he watched the camp, watched the women tending cook fires and the old men sitting together and the children playing their endless games, he saw not enemies but people, saw families, saw a community that would grieve if Takia fell, would suffer from the loss of their leader, just as Natch's people had suffered from the loss of theirs. And he understood with sudden clarity that killing the war chief would solve nothing, would change nothing, would simply extend the cycle of violence into another generation. He was about to pull back, to retreat to where the boy waited and reconsider his options, when he saw something that changed everything. A man emerged from one of the lodges, a man dressed not in traditional Comanche garb, but in the rough clothing of a frontier settler, his pale hair and beard marking him as white even at this distance. The man carried something in his hands, some object he showed to Takia with apparent pride. And even from the ridge Natch could see the war chief's angry response, could see the sharp gesture of dismissal, could see the white man's shoulders slump in apparent disappointment. The man returned to the lodge, and Natch's mind raced with questions. What was a settler doing in a Comanche winter camp? What business did such a man have with a war chief known for his hatred of white encroachment? And why did Takia seem angry at whatever the man had shown him? Natch memorized the camp's layout, counting warriors and noting weapon placements and exits, filing away information with the automatic precision of long training. Then he eased back from the ridge, sliding down the reverse slope until he could rise to hands and knees and make his way back to where the boy waited. The child had not moved, had remained exactly as Natch had positioned him, and when the warrior appeared, the boy's face lit with an expression of relief that suggested he had feared abandonment more than capture. Natch gathered the boy up, secured him once more to his back, and began moving south, away from the ridge, away from the camp, away from the confrontation he had imagined for 3 years. They needed distance, and they needed shelter, and they needed to avoid discovery until Natch could make sense of what he had seen, could understand why a white man lived among the Comanche, and what connection that man might have to the larger questions of tribal warfare and village burning. The sun was setting now, the brief winter day ending in a spectacular display of color that turned the snow to shades of copper and gold, and Natch pushed through gathering shadows toward a line of dark shapes on the southern horizon that might have been trees or might have been rock formations, but either way represented possible shelter. Full darkness fell before he reached the shapes, which resolved into a cluster of large boulders that thrust up through the snow like the fingers of some buried giant. Among the boulders he found gaps and spaces, and in the largest of these gaps he discovered a small cave, really just an overhang, but deeper than the previous night's shelter, and with a floor of sand that showed signs of previous occupation, by animals but not recent enough to present danger. Natch lowered the boy into the cave, then collapsed beside him, his body shaking with exhaustion, his mind foggy with fatigue and cold. The child immediately pressed against him, seeking warmth, and Natch wrapped them both in the remains of the blanket, creating a small nest where their combined body heat might sustain them through another night. He had no food, no fire, nothing but the heat of their own flesh and the shelter of stone, and he knew these things were not enough, knew that another night like the last would drain the reserves they no longer possessed. But before he could address problems of survival, his mind insisted on returning to the image of the white man in the Comanche camp, insisted on worrying at this detail like a tongue probing a loose tooth. What did it mean? What connection existed between white settlers and Comanche raiders? And why did that connection trouble Natch in ways he could not quite articulate? The boy was shivering violently now, his small body convulsing with cold, and Natch forced himself to move despite exhaustion, to rub the child's limbs, to generate heat through friction, to fight off the death that lurked in every shadow of this frozen night. He worked systematically, mechanically, while his mind continued its circling examination of what he had witnessed. After perhaps an hour, the boy's shivering lessened, sleep claiming him despite cold and hunger, and Natch found himself alone with his thoughts in the darkness. He thought about his village, about the raid that had destroyed it, about the details that had never quite fit his understanding of how such things happened. The raiders had known exactly when to strike, had known the men were away hunting, had known where the women would be gathering food. They had moved with the precision of an attack planned in detail, not the opportunistic violence of a chance encounter. And they had burned everything, had destroyed food stores and supplies that a typical raid would have taken as plunder, had acted more like men trying to send a message than men trying to gain wealth. At the time, Natch had been too consumed with grief to question these details, had accepted the raid as simply another instance of the endless warfare between Apache and Comanche. But now, with 3 years' distance and a white man's presence in Takia's camp, he found himself wondering if there might be more to the story, might be layers of deception he had never considered. He dozed fitfully through the night, waking often to check on the boy, to clear snow from the cave entrance, to listen for sounds that might indicate pursuit or danger. Each time he woke, the boy was a little colder, a little less responsive, and Natch understood they were losing the battle against the elements, understood that without intervention, the child would not survive another day. Dawn came gray and cold, the sun hidden behind clouds that promised more snow, and Natch forced himself to move despite the protests of muscles pushed far beyond normal limits. He had to get the boy to the Comanche camp, had to do it today while the child still lived. and he had to do it in a way that did not result in his own immediate death. The problem seemed insoluble, the kind of tactical challenge that appeared in the nightmares of war leaders. But Natch had long since learned that impossible situations simply required more creative solutions. He gathered the boy up, noting the limpness of the small body, the shallow breathing, the grayish tint to the skin, and he knew they were out of time for careful planning. He would have to approach directly, would have to trust in the Comanche's love for their children and their recognition of the boy to stay their arrows long, enough for him to explain his intentions. They set out at first light, Natch carrying the boy now cradled in his arms rather than on his back, trying to share more warmth, trying to stimulate circulation through contact. The child's eyes opened briefly, focused on Natch's face with a clarity that had been absent for hours, and in that gaze the warrior saw understanding, saw acceptance, saw something that might have been gratitude or might have been the last coherent thought before surrender to the inevitable. The journey back to the ridge took most of the morning, Natch moving carefully, stopping often to rest, husbanding strength that no longer existed. When they finally reached the overlook position, he saw that the camp below had changed. More people were visible, moving with the organized urgency of a search party being assembled. And even at this distance, Natch could sense the tension, the fear that came when a child went missing in winter and hope began to fade. He stood, holding the boy so that anyone who looked up would see them silhouetted against the sky, a clear target, an obvious presence. Then he began walking down the slope toward the camp, moving slowly, making no threatening gestures, keeping his hands visible and away from his weapons. The first shout came when he was perhaps 200 yards from the nearest lodge, a cry of alarm that brought warriors boiling out of structures and running toward defensive positions. Arrows were nocked, bows drawn, and Natch saw death approaching in a dozen different trajectories. But he continued walking, continued holding the boy where he could be seen, trusting that recognition would come before arrows flew. It was a woman who stopped the killing, an older woman who emerged from the central lodge and whose scream cut through the morning air with the force of absolute authority. She pointed at the child in Natch's arms, shouted something in Comanche that needed no translation, and the warriors hesitated, lowered their bows fractionally, confused by what they were seeing. Takia appeared then, striding from behind one of the lodges with a rifle in his hands, his face a mask of fury and fear combined. He stopped perhaps 50 paces from Natch, the rifle aimed at the Apache's chest, and for a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other across the distance that separated them, across the years of enmity and the bodies of the dead and the weight of all the violence that had brought them to this moment. Natch slowly, carefully lowered himself to his knees in the snow, laying the boy down gently in front of him, then raising his empty hands to show he held no weapons, meant no threat. The child lay motionless in the snow between them, a small bridge across an abyss of hatred, and Natch saw the war chief's face transform as recognition dawned, as Takia understood that this was his son, was the boy who had been missing for 3 days, was alive against all odds because an Apache warrior had chosen to carry him through a blizzard rather than leave him to die. The woman rushed forward, the boy's mother Natch assumed, and she scooped the child up with a cry of joy and anguish mixed, carrying him back toward the lodges at a run, shouting for blankets and fire and hot broth. Warriors moved to surround Natch, their weapons trained on him from all sides, but Takia held up a hand, stopping them, his eyes never leaving the Apache's face. The war chief moved closer, stopping just out of knife range, his rifle still aimed but his finger off the trigger, and Natch saw in his face the same expression he had seen in his own reflection for 3 years, the look of a man carrying grief like a stone lodged in his chest. They regarded each other in silence, and Natch understood that what happened in the next moments would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the fate of the fragile peace some leaders sought between their peoples. Then something unexpected occurred. From the lodge where Natch had seen the white man emerge the previous evening, a figure appeared, and it was not the settler but a young Comanche warrior, perhaps 20 winters old, carrying something wrapped in cloth. The warrior approached Tasia, speaking rapidly in their language, holding out the wrapped object with apparent excitement. The war chief's face darkened. He barked something harsh that sent the young warrior stumbling backward. But the damage was done. The cloth had fallen away, revealing what lay beneath. It was a medal, Natch saw, one of the silver peace medals the American government gave to tribal leaders as tokens of alliance and recognition. But this medal had been modified, had a name etched on the reverse, and even at a distance Natch could read the inscription: Captain Marcus Webb, 3rd Colorado Territory Volunteers. Natch's mind made connections with lightning speed, assembling pieces of a puzzle he had not known existed. The Colorado Volunteers had been responsible for numerous massacres of peaceful tribes, had earned a reputation for brutality that made even hardened Indian fighters uncomfortable. And if one of their officers had given a peace medal to someone in this camp, had established some kind of relationship with the Comanche... He spoke then, his voice hoarse from cold and disuse, speaking in the trade language that mixed Spanish and native words and hand signs into something most Plains warriors understood. He told Takia to look at the medal, to question where it came from, to think about who might benefit from keeping Apache and Comanche at each other's throats instead of uniting against the real threat to both peoples. Taskia's eyes narrowed, his rifle lowering slightly, and he barked an order that sent warriors running to surround the lodge where the white man stayed. Shouts came from inside, sounds of struggle, and then the settler was dragged out, his pale face flushed with anger or fear, his protests loud and incomprehensible. The war chief spoke to the man in broken English, demanding answers, and the settler's responses came too quickly, too defensively, the words of someone caught in a lie. Takia struck him across the face with the rifle barrel, dropping the man to his knees. And then the questioning began in earnest, the kind of interrogation where truth emerged through pain and the threat of worse to come. What came out over the next hour, as Natch knelt in the snow surrounded by hostile warriors and watched his enemy extract confessions from a man he had trusted, was a story of manipulation that went back years. The settler, Marcus Webb, had been working with a group of land speculators who wanted both Apache and Comanche cleared from territories they intended to claim. He had supplied information to raiding parties on both sides, had told the Comanche when Natch's village would be vulnerable, had told Apache bands when Comanche camps were lightly defended, had orchestrated attacks that kept both tribes weak and focused on each other rather than on the real enemy. The raid that killed Natch's family had been Webb's idea, his plan, executed by Comanche warriors who had no idea they were being used as tools in a larger scheme. And the boy Tenchia's son had been taken on a hunting trip by Webb 2 days before the storm, supposedly to teach the child tracking, but in reality to establish an alibi when the weather turned bad and the boy was lost. Webb had planned to find the child after the storm, cementing his position as a trusted friend of the tribe, but Natch's intervention had ruined that plan. The confession poured out in fits and starts, extracted by methods Natch did not watch but could not avoid hearing, and by the time Webb finally fell silent permanently, the sun had reached its zenith and begun its afternoon descent. Takia stood over the settler's body, his face expressionless, his hands bloody. And then he turned to face Natch with eyes that held something the Apache warrior had not expected to see. Not friendship, not even gratitude, but recognition. The acknowledgement that they had both been deceived, both been used, both been made to serve interests that cared nothing for their peoples or their honor. The war chief made a gesture, a sharp movement that sent warriors scurrying to remove Webb's body, and then he approached Natch, stopping within arm's reach. He spoke in Comanche, his voice low and steady, and though Natch did not understand all the words, he understood the meaning. The debt was acknowledged. The boy's life had been saved. The truth had been revealed. And while this changed nothing about the past, while it could not bring back the dead or heal the wounds that had been inflicted, it created a space where different choices might be possible. Tasia reached down, offered his hand, And after a moment's hesitation, Natch took it, allowing the war chief to pull him to his feet. They stood face to face, two men who should have been enemies, who had every reason to kill each other, who instead found themselves united by the understanding that they had been pawns in someone else's game. The Comanche camp received Natch not as a guest, but as something more complicated, something without a name in either language. He was given food and a place by the fire. His clothes were dried. His wounds, he had not realized he had so many, were tended by the same women who cared for the tribe's own warriors. The boy, Tafia's son, recovered quickly once warmed and fed, and he stayed close to Natch whenever possible, his presence creating a kind of protection, a statement that this Apache had proven himself worthy of trust. Over the next 3 days, while snow fell again and the camp settled into the quiet routines of winter survival, Natch learned things about his enemies that complicated the simple hatred he had carried for 3 years. He learned that Takia had lost his own father to an Apache raid 5 years before, that the war chief's hatred had been fueled by the same grief that consumed Natch. He learned that the Comanche were being squeezed between expanding American settlement and the encroachment of other tribes, were fighting for survival just as desperately as the Apache. He learned that children were children regardless of tribe, that mothers grieved their dead with the same tears, that warriors fought for the same reasons of honor and protection and desperate necessity. And he learned about the web of deception that Webb had woven, the way the settler had identified leaders on both sides who were hungry for revenge, who could be manipulated into actions that served the interests of land speculators and politicians far from the plains. Webb had not worked alone. There were others like him, other agents of chaos who profited from tribal warfare, who ensured that native peoples remained divided and weakened while American power grew inexorably stronger. On the 4th day, the weather cleared, and Takia came to Natch with a proposal. The war chief wanted to send emissaries to the Apache bands, wanted to share what had been learned, wanted to explore the possibility of peace, or at least an end to the manipulation that had kept them fighting. He asked if Natch would carry that message, would speak for him among his people, would help build something different from the endless cycle of revenge. Natch considered the request for a long time, weighing it against the ghosts of his dead, against the memory of smoke and screaming and the village that no longer existed. He thought about his sister's son, about Delche who had died because Comanche warriors followed orders from a man who cared nothing for the boy's life. And he thought about Takia's son, about the child who now followed him around camp with absolute trust, who had survived because one warrior chose to carry him rather than abandon him. He agreed, knowing the decision would be seen by many Apache as betrayal, knowing that peace was far from certain and might be impossible given the depth of accumulated grievances. But he agreed because the alternative was to continue serving interests that benefited from their destruction, because Webb's confession had revealed a truth that could not be ignored, because somewhere in the long walk through the blizzard with a child on his back, Natch had remembered that life meant more than revenge. The boy brought him a gift before he left, a small carved figure of a horse that the child had made himself, the work clumsy but heartfelt. Natch accepted it with grave ceremony, tucking it into his parfleche alongside the few possessions he carried, and then he knelt so he was at eye level with the boy. They looked at each other for a long moment, warrior and child, Apache and Comanche, enemies who had become something else through the crucible of survival. Then Natch stood, gathered his weapons and his meager supplies, and began the long walk back to his own people. Behind him the Comanche camp grew smaller, the smoke from their fires fading into the pale winter sky, and ahead lay territory he knew by heart. Mountains that had sheltered his people for generations, canyons where Apache children still played and old men still told stories of better days. The snow had stopped but the cold remained, and as Natch walked he felt it seeping through his clothing, felt it working into his bones with the familiarity of an old companion. This land killed the careless and the unlucky, killed them without mercy or remorse, and yet people persisted. Peoples persisted, finding ways to survive against all odds, because survival was what humans did. was written into the deepest parts of their nature. He thought about the village he had lost, about the faces he would never see again, about the life that had been stolen by men who saw native peoples as obstacles to be removed or tools to be exploited. And he thought about the boy who lived because one warrior chose mercy over vengeance, chose to carry a burden rather than add another body to the count of the dead. The sun was setting by the time he reached the first familiar landmarks, the distinctive rock formation that marked the southern entrance to Apache territory, and he paused there to look back the way he had come. The land stretched away empty and white under a sky that had cleared to reveal stars, beginning to emerge in the darkening east. Somewhere in that vastness was a Comanche camp where a boy slept safe beside his father, where warriors debated the meaning of peace, where old enmities confronted new possibilities. Natch turned toward the mountains, toward the canyon where his band had wintered, toward the conversations that would be difficult and the decisions that would divide opinion and the long, slow work of building something different from the violence that had consumed them all. He carried a message from one war chief to another, carried the hope that understanding might replace manipulation, carried the small carved horse that represented a child's gratitude and a bridge across an abyss. The stars emerged fully as darkness claimed the land, their light cold and distant, but somehow comforting in its permanence. Men lived and died, tribes rose and fell, villages burned and children cried, but the stars remained, watching with their infinite patience while humans worked out their complicated relationships with survival and vengeance, and the possibility of something better. Natch walked on through the gathering night, a solitary figure moving through snow that would not melt until spring, carrying stories that would change nothing and everything, bearing witness to the truth that enemies were made not born, that hatred was taught and could therefore be untaught, that even in the darkest cold, a man could choose to carry life rather than death. Behind him the wind erased his tracks, covering the signs of his passage with fresh snow, and the land returned to its winter silence, empty and waiting, patient as the stars, knowing that spring would come eventually, and with it the chance for things to grow again, for new stories to replace the old, for the cycle to continue in its endless turning towards something that might yet prove worth the struggle of survival. The blizzard had swallowed the world in white, but it had also revealed something unexpected in the heart of that whiteness, not the death that should have been there, but life, stubborn and fragile and absolutely determined to persist. And one warrior had chosen to honor that life, had chosen to carry it through the storm, and in that choosing had found not redemption, but perhaps something more valuable, the understanding that choice itself was the only freedom that truly mattered, the only power that could not be taken away no matter how much else was lost. Natch reached the canyon as full night settled over the mountains, and he saw the fires of his people flickering like small stars in the darkness below, and he took a breath of the frozen air and began his descent toward whatever waited, carrying his message and his memories and the small carved horse that represented everything he had learned about enemies and children and the long walk through the killing cold towards something that might yet prove worth calling hope.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.